First of all, just introduce myself. I'm Rob Lucas, FSC Chief Executive, and my partners in crime in this presentation are Nick Lapthorne, who's one of my colleagues and also chairs the GA's Special Interest Group for Fieldwork, and Andy Owen, who's hiding behind the screen, there we are, who will reveal himself in a dramatic fashion later on, perhaps not. Okay, so I'm sure you've all completed your starter activities as opposed to working out where you're going for your second contrasting locality to undertake your fieldwork later on today. So the cards you had were just one of the ideas, please do take them away with you, about how you might approach perhaps setting the scene for fieldwork and getting students to think about the questions that you might use, which are much more open perhaps than some of the questions that we have perhaps become accustomed to at GCSE over the last 3 years really. So the title of the talk, The Future Assessment of Fieldwork, which is clearly why everybody's rushing in because they love assessment. I think that one of our challenges, and this is a challenge for the whole of us, not the awarding bodies, not the DFE, it's a challenge for everybody, is to rise to the challenge that Ian Stewart presented us in the public lecture yesterday evening, which is how do we actually engage with those 60% of the people who are not interested in science and who have no understanding of science, and yet we have to engage them as environmentally literate citizens in order to be able to tackle some of the really big issues that we're facing in terms of climate change and other environmental issues. So I think that's really our challenge. Of course, the detail, as we know, is how it's assessed makes a big difference, because how it's assessed tends to determine what we do. But that's the kind of context of it, isn't it? It's in some ways we're kind of starting at the wrong end with our telescope. So just to update folks, then you'll be familiar, I think, with the basic timetable. I think two things to pick out from this diagram. One is that we're actually halfway through the cycle of the current GCSE coursework model. Okay. There are another 500,000 or so GCSE geography students still to go through the present approach. So we must remember not to discard those and think, let's start thinking about 2017 when everything's changed and we're doing our new coursework. Probably not coursework, we'll come to that. Okay. The other thing to note from this slide is that in practical terms, both the GCSE and the GCE are going to be changing at the same time. Okay, so they are in sync, which hasn't always been the case, and in fact isn't the case for all the subjects, I don't think, in the curriculum review. In a bit more detail, then we've just had the material published for the GCSE, and so when we originally wrote the title for this presentation, and we're working with WJC, and thank you WJC for sponsoring this event, we actually assumed we would know the detail, and then as we got closer to the event we realised we may well not know the detail, so we prepared the presentation on that basis, and then on Thursday last week then out came the information. And of course, that's close enough, that's far enough away for us to not ignore, that would appear negligent, but not far enough away to actually have all the answers. So that's why Andy's going at the end, because he's got an extra 30 minutes, which is about 4% longer than we had at the start of this talk, to work out what the answers are going to be. So, the timetable is set out as there. There is a consultation going on at the moment for GCE, and that's been discussed in two separate areas. So the ALCAB, the Russell Group University, is looking at content, and the GA, amongst others, is represented on that group, and there is also a separate discussion going on about assessment. But again, we'll have the same timetable for teaching. And for those who've downloaded them, then they were whizzing off the press on Thursday morning. So there's geography and history and science and English all kind of came out in a bit of a rush, as well as later in that afternoon, Ofqual's view of assessment. So where does that leave us in summary? I think first of all, it's important to know that fieldwork is crucial to the strong role envisaged for geography in the revised and more challenging curriculum at all levels. And then a very strong statement about fieldwork. The scheme of assessment must include an identifiable element or elements assessing fieldwork, and this must include assessment of the students' own experiences of the fieldwork. And that's going to be an awful lot of detail and challenge for the awarding bodies to work out how that is reflected accurately. And it will be assessed at GCSE through examination only, and that will comprise 15% of the total assessment weighting, and that's at the higher level things rather than content, rather than knowledge. Okay, and that would reflect actually the Secretary of State's view. It's not often you think of the Secretary of State as your friend, but I'll just quote something he said at the launch of a document called Reaching into the Outside, which FSC was involved in. And first of all, we were quite surprised he agreed to turn up, and being as it was very difficult to brief the Secretary of State, if anybody's ever met him, you'll realise it's very difficult to brief the Secretary of State. He came in and spoke very passionately about fieldwork, and he said, amongst other things, I worry that our children are growing up without the opportunity to learn and to grow out of doors. How can you know how this land was shaped and formed, and how choices that people made in the past determine the lives we live now, unless you had the chance to study geography and spend some time seeing how the natural world shaped the planet? That's quite a strong statement from the Secretary of State in terms of the importance they feel that fieldwork has, and the evidence would suggest that fieldwork has lots of benefits. And they're more than just being a geographer, really. There are lots of skills that we develop, which we'll pick up on later, which are actually really useful life skills, the kind of things that employers are looking for, which are not there in the geography curriculum per se, but are very important factors. So, 3 aims: getting to think about this thinking geographically, which I'll just cover, exploring strategies, which Nick will cover, and analysing the assessment objective weightings, which Andy will cover. Okay, so thinking geographically. So why do we do fieldwork? Interestingly, when we were thinking about what happens if we do get the information, what happens if we don't get the information, then one of the things actually is that good fieldwork is still good fieldwork, irrespective of what the assessment model is, and the approach to good fieldwork is the same, really, irrespective of what the content you're investigating. So it might be presented in slightly different ways, and obviously the physical things you do might be different, but the approach is the same. And interestingly, this crosses over, doesn't it, with one of the things, I think it was number 4 of Ian's things you had to achieve with the public, was giving them this sense of awe and wonder. A sense that somehow it's a bit magical out there. And I think some of that is scale, isn't it? I don't know where that one is, but it looks like it should be Iceland or somewhere, the left-hand picture. Not because it's raining, but because there's clearly I would guess, a fossil cliff somewhere on the coast. Partly because it's taking people into environments that they've never been into before. One of the challenges when FSC was set up 70 years ago The reason it was created was because our founder, Francis Butler, who was an inspector of schools for London, was so horrified at the lack of understanding of the countryside that the children they were evacuating out of London had, that he came up with this idea of a network of field centres. Kind of interestingly, I'm not sure how much we've moved on. If 60% still have no real connection with the environment, 60% still probably can't recognise a cow from a chicken, if it's not wrapped up from Sainsbury's, then it's interesting that even with all the modern aids we've got, how much we have advanced on that. So this awewonder, this sense of empathy, a feeling of connecting, and that can also be revealed at a more subtle level. So when people are working together and working in teams and sharing ideas, then fieldwork very much lends itself to this, isn't it? The first thing you do is kind of divide people into groups and get them doing things. It's a classic approach to fieldwork, isn't it? You know, doing rivers fieldwork is probably the best kind of icebreaker bonding activity you can come up with, because it has them solving problems in a group, and they have to share, they develop lots and lots of skills. So that's important. And interestingly, if you look at the Sutton Trust report about great ways to spend your pupil premium, then I think this is at 5th on the list of most effective things to do. And actually, if you include, the top one is giving your students feedback, okay, and the cost of that is very small, and actually collaborative learning is very small, the cost of it, but the impact is very big. I think it's about plus 6 months in a year, something like that, the impact of collaborative learning. So if you look on the Sutton Trust website, you can find the details of that. There's also this kind of learning by doing, discovering a sense of scale, a sense of how things relate to each other, particularly how things relate that are disconnected in the geography specifications. So this beach that these students are thinking about being plunging breakers on, and wondering of the impact that that's going to have on the beach and whether it's going to move sediment down the beach or push sediment up the beach, just behind here is a road. So there's a very human geography issue about a road that's going to be breached by the sea, and in fact was completely covered and partially breached by the sea this winter. So it allows them to connect things which sit in different pigeonholes within the specification. And that's inevitable when you're teaching indoors, because you can't do everything all at the same time. You have to have some kind of structure to it. But once people are outside, then they join those things up, providing you allow them to do it. You don't if you very much constrain what they're going to do. And so our aim is to get people to think like a geographer, which is interesting. We could have a broad discussion about what thinking like a geographer is, but it is a kind of theme that runs through the new national curriculum, really, isn't it? Is to think in the way that's appropriate for your subjects. If you're a scientist, you're expected to work scientifically. Okay, so it's a kind of ethos of how you do things. It's not, we're going to have a lesson on thinking like a geographer today. It's all those things you do about gathering that information, about asking questions, processing information, and so on. Things which, that kind of route to inquiry, which has had lots of labels and lots of titles, but it's the same basic cyclical model, isn't it? Of coming up with the question and then observing, collecting, recording, representing, analysing, and then applying what you know, and then reviewing. One of the problems with the current model of assessment at GCSE is it encourages you to focus on the observe, collect, record, and the represent and analyse. So students quite often get the impression that what they're doing is that the object is to collect a clean set of data. A set of data, and by that I mean a set that's not too many irregularities, not too many awkward bits to explain. And that's a bit of a missed opportunity, really, because actually, for the fieldwork, the really exciting bits come when they actually pose the questions, as we'll come on to. The other thing, which one of my former trustees, he was a vice chancellor of a university in London, said, why do we spend so much time collecting data to state the bleeding obvious? So when we do things and collect data and sampling, it should reveal something that's not obvious. So obviously there are some things like the soil and what's in it and what's underneath it, which isn't obvious to the average person. So by sampling you can reveal that. There are some things which perhaps surprise students about speed of flow of rivers when they look at turbulence and equate that to velocity. So there are some things we can do, but we've got to make sure we're not just getting them to collect data. So the aim is we end up with a nice set of data that proves, at its most extreme, good question, is this landscape glaciated, yes or no? Are we in a lecture theatre, yes or no? It's kind of, we've got to make sure the questions are meaningful in geographical terms and educational terms. One of the things that geography has become quite focused on and has a role to play in this is this transmission of tasks and skills. And at its best, this can enable us to have a very broad toolbox of techniques and experiences of using different sorts of equipment in interesting and innovative ways. In fact, you don't need a huge amount of equipment to do much of the field work that we do. But there are things that are kind of an expectation now, aren't there? Things like GIS. Every time somebody comes and delivers your parcel, then that's all being tracked through a GPS system and online, and it'll go and tell him where to go to next, and so on and so forth. So things that we think is quite cutting edge are just like bog standard to your white van driver. And we're behind the curve on that, so we need to kind of up our game a bit. So there are some good things that can do. At its worst level, when you really find out what the students have learnt on their fieldwork is they've learnt how to use a ruler. And they can measure the depth of the water and the size of the pebbles with their ruler. And that's not a very high level skill for GCSE. So we have to make sure they have the context for that. Which is why we actually want them to tackle not the one, but all 5 of these areas. And interestingly, there's some work being done at the moment by the Paul Hamlin Foundation Learning Away project, which has found that the key thing for delivering the educational objectives that you want is to get the students engaged in the planning process. Because that's when they really engage in what they're trying to do. So you don't put them on a bus, you don't go, today we're going to the Lake District, the coast, the park, and you appear, and then you magically pull out the bag of equipment, which is everything you've got in your kind of equipment cupboard, and go, right, today we're going to do this, this, and this. Okay, so we have to engage them in the process. And that's quite challenging. It's quite challenging if you think, hang on a minute, I'm not so confident about doing this because they might come up with things that I'm not sure about. They might come up with things that we don't have the equipment to deal with. But actually, if you present the problem to them and the constraints, that's part of reality, isn't it? They are managing resources. I remember I was on an FSC trip to Iceland about 30 years ago now, and we were mapping some glacier snouts. And it was a bit of an afterthought, because it wasn't really a scientific expedition, we were actually doing something else. And so our equipment consisted of my tent pole, which had a scale-affixed set of numbers stuck onto it, which was 1 metre tall. a 50-metre length of string with knots every metre and a compass clinometer. And with that, we were able to map to probably plus or minus about 2 metres the end of the snout of the glacier. And that glacier is the one actually which is was Eyjafjallajökull, the one that erupted and has now filled up Gígusjökull, which is the crater at the bottom, and that's the one that we actually mapped. And it's quite interesting to have that very crude data that we collected and think, my goodness, it changed quite dramatically compared to what we were. But you don't need sophisticated equipment. You need to present it with the problem of what are you trying to prove, what are you trying to investigate, how are you going to go about it, what constraints do you have. Our main constraint was we had an awful lot of other stuff to carry as well. That kind of route to inquiry is articulated much better here in Margaret's diagram. But you can see the sequence we have to go through in terms of creating a need to know. And that's the key bit, isn't it? Creating a need to know. People only really become engaged when they feel they need to know it. The other bits flow from that. And if you now think in your practical terms, then when you're trying to kind of manage this process, then the left-hand end of this table is the comfortable end of the process from the teacher's point of view. Because you're managing all the bits, you're determining the things that can happen, you're framing the work they're going to do, and the ideal is the right-hand end, which is much more challenging. And we probably end up in, certainly at GCSE level, where a good question is probably somewhere in this kind of boundary here. So it's not completely open. You know, I'd like to go and study glacial outwash in Iceland is probably quite challenging for most schools to organise. So you're framing the discussion with what you can and can't do in terms of access. But you could actually go to the site, or of course now we have these amazing resources. You don't actually have to go to the site. You can go and visit it on Google Earth, you can get the maps, you can actually get a sense of what the place is like and begin to pose questions before you go. So you don't have to go there first, do your recce, come back and think, this is what we might need. You've actually got access to resources which could help you do that. And there are some, you only have to go around the kind of exhibitors area here to realise there are some phenomenal geographical resources to help support you, and some brilliant resources on the GA website to help support you in this process. In assessment terms, the problem is, if you do the left-hand end, is that the grades your students get are largely determined by what you've set them. So the differentiation is really by the centre as opposed to by the individual, because you've constrained it so much that frankly it's going to be really challenging for it to go wrong, because that's playing very safe, isn't it? That's what you set up. Because as teachers you have this kind of, well, the worst thing that can happen is we go out, we do the field work, and it's a disaster. We get there and the river's flooded. We get there and, oh my goodness, the coast has been absolutely battered by the storms and we can't do the field work we were going to do. When you have this absolutely fantastic resource of a piece of coast which has just been actually a bit of live geography going on, and you kind of go, can't do that one, because it's not what we were planning to do. We were going to look at measuring sediment one side of the groin to the other, and the groin's being washed away. We've just got to be a bit more open and creative. I think the other thing which is also a challenge for us is the fact that for many students, when they do the piece of assessment, whichever route they go down, whether at the left or right hand end of this diagram, that's quite often the first piece of fieldwork that they will have done. So if you think of the analogy of your driving test, okay, so the theory test you're going to sit in an exam room and answer some questions. They've been practicing for 12 years or more at that bit. And then the really exciting bit that they've never done before, they get one go at and you're assessed at. And just imagine doing that on your driving test. So, okay, we've done the theory, everything's okay, now let's get out there. You've not seen a car before? Well, that's fine, it'll be good. You know, just follow these instructions, drive down here, turn left, measure the depth, go around the corner, count the pedestrians. And so we really need to get people out into the field more, and that doesn't mean taking them to Iceland, or doesn't mean taking them miles and miles and miles away. You know, you can do brilliant field work round the corner from school, in the school grounds, in your local parks, in your local, on your local stream, in your local town, in your local village. And somehow we've got a thinking that the work that somehow field work is a bit of a luxury, an expensive luxury, because we could be finishing off the last page of the textbook or the last chapter of that textbook. And the evidence from Ofsted and others, and Ofsted are big supporters of fieldwork, is that actually fieldwork delivers really powerful learning. And even when it's not done very well, it still delivers pretty powerful learning. And so we must remember that actually just take that risk. It's a nice day, something's happened, go outside, look at the clouds if you're doing something on weather. You know, don't actually just sit in the classroom and do something. The physical, the health and safety restrictions and so on are much less than you might imagine. If you're going to go and do something local, read what the guidance says. It's really is in no way discouraging you from doing that. So, remember overall, there'll be detail in exactly what the assessment model goes, but the real challenge is how do you get environmentally literate citizens? Not how do you get people to get over that C boundary, B boundary, A boundary, wherever you want them for your school, wherever your aspiration is, or if you're working in primary school, then which level do you want them to be at as they go forward. Then actually the key thing is how do you engage them, because actually we want them to be engaged and excited and interested. Because if we put them off geography, then it doesn't matter how good geography is higher up the school, it doesn't matter how good it gets at A level or university, they're not going to do it. We want them engaged in the process.